Really is no more elegant way to hang a door than with knife hinges. They're stronger, they're mostly hidden, and when you're done, you could drink your coffee or tea with your pinky out. So today we're going to focus specifically on the L-shaped version, and if you can install the L-shaped version, you can certainly do a straight knife version. So the first step is actually dealing with the cabinet, because we have to make sure that the cabinet is sized correctly for the opening so that these guys will work. In this case, I'm looking for a nice even 32nd of an inch gap around the entire door. Yeah, that's pretty tiny, but it's fairly easy to sneak up on the fit if you've got some 32nd of an inch shims. So why a 32nd of an inch? Because that's the gap between the hinge leaves based on that little washer that's around the post. If you don't have the means to make a 32nd of an inch shim, you might be able to use a card scraper or even a couple of playing cards. However, if they aren't Star Trek cards, I'm not sure that they're going to work. Now ideally, you want to do this work before the cabinet is glued up, because then we can take it apart and have easy access for routing or whatever kind of tools you want to use to make your mortises. If the cabinet is glued up already, you're probably just going to have to resort to using a chisel for at least the cabinet side of this mortise set. But for me, luckily, I just have everything held with clamps. Now, the key is you have to make sure, if you're going to do this, that your rails are locked into position, meaning that when I go to actually glue them up, I'm going to get them in the same exact spot as they are right now. If that doesn't happen, then we're in trouble. Right? So we want to be very careful about the location of those rails. First things first, let's do the mortises in the case, or in this case, my front frame. Now this is a cool use for a traditional hand screw clamp. I use it to hold the frame vertically and then clamp the clamp securely to the table. On the case side hinge, we're going to account for the 32nd of an inch gap between the door and the frame by using a shim. The wood shims would work here, but metal gives a nice positive registration, and some thin scrapers are pretty close to a 32nd of an inch. With the post hinge leaf tight against the shim, and with the long leg of the hinge roughly centered, I'll use a marking knife to scribe the end of the hinge. I'll also scribe the side of the short leg. We're really only concerned with the side-to-side positioning at this point, not so much the front to back. Knife lines can be tricky to see, especially on darker woods, so it's a good idea to use a pencil to darken the line. This knifing process is repeated on the other side and then again on the top rail. And the rest of the process is much easier to do if the parts are disassembled. So now at the workbench, we are going to do the actual mortising, but first we need to know front to back where this guy is going to go. Now, we certainly could have just used our marking knife to trace around it, but there's a couple reasons I don't like to do that. One, the hinge can kind of move ever so slightly, and just that little bit of movement out of square can be exaggerated along this length, and that just can be problematic. And I've done it like that in the past. It can work, but I find that this is what I'm going to show you here is a little bit more consistent. I'm going to use a cutting gauge. The other reason for this is because each one of these, we have quite a few to do. So if we can get something set like a cutting gauge to get our lines drawn, or at least one of our lines drawn, that's going to be more accurate. Rather than trying to do this action on each and every one of these, we're just going to use the cutting gauge. So what do we set this cutting gauge to? We're going to start with the innermost line, this long edge here. Well, we don't actually need to measure anything. We can just kind of do the math. Now this is a 3/4 inch workpiece, and this hinge leaf is 3/8 of an inch. So if I grab my Mortimer Ichabod marker here, boy, that's an old reference. This is my 3/4 inch workpiece. And here is my hinge, which is slightly inset with this L shape. We know this is 3/8. We know this is 3/4. Like that. So then this must be 3/16, 3/16, if we have it perfectly centered. So if I'm just drawing this back edge here, that's simply 3/16 plus 3/8, and that is 9/16 of an inch. And all you metric people, I don't want to hear it. This is fine. Now my cutting gauge is set for about 9/16 of an inch. Now I say about because I don't actually care if it's dead on perfect 9/16. The reason for that is because I'm going to use this for all of the case parts and then of course the doors themselves. So I'm really mostly concerned about the setback from that front edge. And as long as it's the same on each one of those, it doesn't matter if I hit 9/16 or if I'm maybe just a hair off from that. I'm going to get as close as I can, but if it's slightly off, we negate that by making sure it's the same on each and every one of these mortises. So this is set for 9/16-ish, and that's enough to do the work. I'll use the cutting gauge to cut that 9/16 back line in between the two lines that I already have on the workpiece. Now with my knife in the new line, I'll bump the hinge up against the knife to locate it from front to back. I could then draw an approximate line on the front edge with a pencil. I'm not really ready to commit to that line yet, so that's why I'm using a pencil here. To cut the mortise, I'll use a router and a 1/4 inch bit, but first I need to set the depth. Using the hinge itself, I'll get as close as I can. Test cut and scrap, make any needed adjustments, and then test again. That's good enough for spag work. To do the mortising, I'll sandwich the rail between a couple of pieces of scrap for some extra router support. Then I could route the mortise, taking care not to cross over any of the lines. Using sharp chisels, I'll clean up the ends of the mortise as well as the back knife line. Knife lines are great because you could just set your chisel right into the line for that last chop, and it's going to be perfect every time as long as your knife line is in the right spot. Just be careful here as the material does get pretty fragile.
I think that says fragile, honey.
To take care of the front line, I'll press the hinge snug against the back line and then angle my marking knife inward slightly to make the front cut. If you don't angle the knife, the mortise will most likely be just a hair too wide. Now I can simply chisel the front line and then test the fit. Even with slightly out of focus and unprofessional footage, you can see that it's pretty snug. Now that gets repeated for the remaining rail mortises. If you're new to this process, start with the top rail first since those are less visible. If you screw the pooch, you can at least bank on the fact that no one will see the mistake. By the time you get to the bottom rail, you'll already have 2 of them under your belt. I'd like to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Brusso Hardware. Brusso is a New Jersey-based hardware company that specializes in high-end, American-made hardware such as pulls, knobs, hinges of all kinds, and even specialized hardware for small boxes and cabinets. I've been using Brusso hardware in my work since, well, the beginning. And since then, they've been my go-to source for hardware that's a fitting accompaniment to what I would consider fine woodworking. Because the hardware is milled to such a precise standard and the components are nice and thick, it's incredibly easy to get a good, predictable result. And you'll never have to deal with wimpy, thin hinge leaves that are totally out of flat. And one of my favorite things is the fact that Brusso includes a steel screw with all of their hinges to allow you to cut the threads first without risking damaging the included brass screws. For more information, head to brusso.com and see what all the fuss is about. A lot of companies make hardware, but there's really only one Brusso hardware. Now let's get back to the installation. So now that the mortises and the rails are done, we could start to work on the door side of this connection. Unfortunately, the cool thing about this is we already have all the information that we need. It's going to be fairly easy to do this on the doors. The big difference with the door and how it relates to our hinge leaf is that we aren't going to have to push this one in a 32nd. We did that on the frame already. That's moving our door to provide that 32nd of an inch gap. So on the door itself, we really just want to be flush. So grab yourself a nice flat piece of material, kind of like we did before. We're going to center front to back like this, but we're doing it while we are resting up against this extra piece. And once I have that roughly centered, carefully hold that leaf in place and then scribe the end points. Okay, there's our 2 ends. Be kind to your eyes. Put a little pencil in there. And here's where the great part of it comes in, the fact that we already have this guy set. The key here is we're referencing from the front face of the door, just like we reference from the front face of the rails. And that ensures that in each of these situations, whether it's a door or a frame, that this guy will be placed from front to back the same distance every single time. So that's why once you lock this sucker in, you do not want to move it. And then once we have that guy on here, this is really a repeat of what we did before on the frame. Just going to kind of line that up, eyeball it, give myself a pencil line so I don't cross it. And now we can do the routing, then scribe the front line, and chisel everything. Once you have a good fit, it's time to drive the screws. Some hinge companies provide a steel screw, which is super helpful as brass screws can strip pretty easily. I'll use a self-centering bit to make the pilot hole and then drive the steel screw with some wax on the threads. With the threads cut, I could safely switch to the brass screws. You still need to be cautious, but the brass is a lot less likely to strip in a pre-threaded hole. I often do the first one by hand just to get a feel for the amount of resistance. Once I'm confident that I won't have issues, I use a drill at a low speed. So now I'll bring the frame together and test fit the entire door. Obviously, this whole process is repeated for the right door, but you get the idea. And there it is. I think I could live with that result. Thanks for watching. Dang it, I didn't get it centered.